Okay, so now that we've had a bit of an introduction, the first example we're going to look at is the US South, specifically the Prussian road to capitalism, or what the article Jonathan Weiner called the Prussian road to capitalism. So I think the way I'll do this, I'll just give you a bit of an intro. I'll talk about some of just at least try to give you a sense of those historiographic debates that may have been a little confusing in the Weiner piece, right? He talks about all these different historians, and it's important to know that, but I'm just going to try to simplify it for you a little bit and then really explain this transition that happens in the US South while also giving you a bit of background to the American South. I mean, you know a little bit about it already because we looked at the rise of slavery mostly in the Caribbean, but also looked at it in the US South as well. So as I said, most of the South's road to capitalism is explained in the readings this week. Jonathan Weiner's class structure in the South after the Civil War. Now, what he was responding to is debates in U.S. historiography over the South's development to industrial capitalism. Now, if we go back a few weeks ago, we looked at the role of slavery in the history of capitalism. We remember that initially historians saw capitalism as a feudal relic, a holdover from a more primitive, unfree period that capitalism was supposed to get rid of. And of course, we now know that historians understand slavery is central to the rise of capitalism. It created a form of staple crop production, it commodified human beings, and was producing increasingly for a globalized market. We also learned the central role of sugar as one of the first kind of mass commodities combined with tea that allowed the first industrial workers of England the necessary calories and mild stimulant in the form of caffeine to work the hours that industrial wage workers worked in the late 18th and early 19th century. Slavery was, of course, abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s and in the United States in 1865 when the South is defeated by the North in the American Civil War. Now that slavery was defeated, the South was rid of what is often referred to as its peculiar institution. The reason was the South developed a very distinct society of slavery. I mean, you had other slave societies in the world, but the South was unique in that they were the only slave society to really develop a philosophical pro-slavery argument that, I mean, yeah, you could argue that there was a pro-slavery argument, but the argument was in places like Brazil and the Caribbean, it makes me money if you're the slave owner. In the US South, they move away from this kind of, it's a necessary evil to make me money, to no, there's this philosophical tradition with people like John C. Calhoun, if you're interested, who actually argue that no, slavery is the key to American prosperity. It is the key. It is the ideal society. You don't get that developed anywhere in any other slave society in the world except in the southern United States, which makes it unique. And it's why it was often referred to as the peculiar institution. So what happens is there's this debate in U.S. historiography, and this is what the article that Weiner writes is responding to. Now, many historians, at least initially, saw the South's capitalist development in a kind of traditional sense, that once it was freed of slavery, the economy would follow a similar path toward industrial capitalism that the North followed. But as Weiner shows, the South followed a distinct path. It was neither the same as the North, nor just a kind of offshoot. It was its own thing. And part of the reason he calls it the Prussian road to capitalism is that it is capitalism without liberal democracy, right? Capitalism and liberal democracy seem to go hand in hand in England, in the United States, in France, and so on. But in the case of the American South, you do not get the emergence of liberal democracy and capitalism at the same time. It's a different system. It's similar, and the reason he calls it the Prussian road is because you basically get that. In Prussia and eventually Germany, you get the rise of capitalism, but without liberal democracy. So there's 2 points here. There's an illiberal political system. Other historians acknowledge this. The illiberal political system that I'm referring to is obviously Jim Crow segregation, where African Americans' political and civil rights were severely restricted, if completely non-existent. But as Weiner shows, there's a second part of the equation, and this is the part of the equation that a lot of traditional historians of U.S. capitalism had missed, which was there was an equally unfree, illiberal labor market specifically, but more broadly, economic system. There wasn't really a free market in the South to the same extent that there was in the North and England. African Americans' mobility were severely restricted, and the labor market was severely restricted. This was not free labor that emerges after the Civil War, even if slavery no longer exists. The key thing that Weiner adds is that this was an oppressive system, but so was the economy. It wasn't just that it was an oppressive political system, but it was also an oppressive economic system. Now, part of the reason he's able to see this is that he focuses more on class conflict. So just to give you a bit of background into it, is that at the end of the Civil War, slavery is officially banned in the United States. It begins with the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, but is fully abolished in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolishes slavery and forced servitude except as punishment for a crime, which seems like an insignificant detail, the punishment for a crime, but we'll come back to that. It's actually very important. So now that slavery was abolished, the United States, especially the Southern leaders, were confronted with a problem. Well, what labor system is going to replace it? Now remember, in the case of the British last week, we saw that they weren't sure how to replace slavery. The British, of course, turned to a system of indentured servitude, whether it's from their own colonial subjects in India or workers from China. And in the South, what emerges as a replacement to slavery is a system known as sharecropping. And I'll explain exactly what sharecropping is in a minute, but before we get there, and we should look at why sharecropping develops. Because the question that many of you may be asking yourselves is, well, why, when these societies ended slavery, why didn't they just make their former slaves wage earners? It seems to be the simplest thing. It would allow them more flexibility as a labor force, less responsibility, and everything. Yeah, why not do that? Now, before we get there, I just want to give you a kind of background into Southern society. What we're going to see is the destruction of slavery. A ruling consensus emerged where you have white land owned by white former slave owners who are now just plantation owners, worked by black labor, a return to staple crop agriculture with cotton, tobacco, sugar, etc. And for the freed people, the former slaves, what we'll see is in many ways a retreat from the market and a move towards subsistence, but also a great hunger for land. So, initially, the planters actually want wage labor. And this is one of the key things that the historians that Jonathan Weiner is arguing against missed. They thought that planters wanted sharecropping because they felt, oh, this is a rational system that will make sense and it will be efficient. But in reality, as Weiner points out, when we go back and look at the historical records and the primary sources, most former slave owners and now just plantation owners wanted wage labor. And part of the reason they wanted wage labor is they wanted to maintain a centralized plantation structure. They may not own people anymore or that work for them, but they still own the land and the crops that they would work on. This was the key thing about these plantations. Even though they didn't follow that classic case, this large plantation made possible staple crop production. But, and this is why it's so important to study class conflict as well as market expansion. Indeed, these early historians who understood it from a purely market expansion thesis missed how sharecropping actually emerged. Wage labor, as I said, was initially the planters' preferred method of production. It was the former slaves, the freed men and women, which is what they were called, that pushed back. They didn't want to work as wage laborers. Part of the reason why they didn't want to work as wage laborers is this. Think about it from their perspective. Working for wages on a centralized plantation meant that they would be working in a very similar manner to when they were slaves. They weren't slaves, but they would have worked in gangs, just like under slavery. They would have worked for a white overseer, just like under slavery, who was often extremely cruel. Maybe wouldn't be quite as cruel after slavery, but it wasn't going to be a great relationship. They didn't want to work under the supervision of their former masters. And you can understand why they wouldn't. If you've been owned your entire life, your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and your children who you thought were going to be slaves their entire life, no longer would. You would want to get out of that oppressive system, or at least get as much out of it as you possibly could. So this is partly what's motivating them not to work as wage laborers. And moreover, they wanted what everybody else that had ever come to America after Europeans first started coming to America, and it was land. They wanted their own land. They wanted their own farms, just like the farmers who moved into the American interior, right? They wanted to be left alone in a lot of ways. They wanted autonomy, and it makes sense. If you were the legal property of somebody, and all of a sudden you weren't, you wouldn't want to be controlled by anybody at that point. So what we're going to see is the failure of wage labor and the breakup of single-unit plantations. Now, sharecropping was the system that emerged out of this conflict. Wage labor failed because the former slaves resisted and pushed back. Now, I'm going to explain what sharecropping is, just for a minute. Sharecropping is very similar, but it's not the same thing as a kind of landed peasantry. So instead of working for wages, what the plantation owner did was, and if we go to the next slide, I can explain this better. Here's what a plantation owner looked like under slavery, right? You got the master's house, you have the slave quarters, it's very centralized, right? Now this is what it looks like under sharecropping. So the way it worked under sharecropping was instead of working for wages, the slaves were broken up into their respective families, and they were given plots of land on the plantation. You can see here, these different plots of land are worked by these specific slave families or individuals, right? And so this is the way it worked. Slaves were essentially given land to rent, but they had no money. They were just slaves. They had no access to money. So basically the way it worked was instead of paying for the land in cash, it was very similar to the peasant. At the end of the harvest, half of the crop or a share of the crop would go to the master, and then the rest of it would go to the slave, right? So that half of the crop or more than half the crop that goes to the master is their payment. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a pretty good system in the sense that they have autonomy, they get some of what they're producing, and in exchange, they pay a share of their crop to the master. In reality, it's actually much more sinister and dependent. So what happens is these former slaves don't have any money, right? That's why they have to give a share of the crop. But they also don't have any tools. And the former master is not just going to give them tools. They have to buy tools. Because they have no money, they have to borrow money to buy the tools. So they either take credit out from the plantation owner himself or a middleman like a local merchant. And at the end of that year, when the share of the crop is due, often the amount of money they were borrowing to buy their tools, their mules, drafting animals, and whatever they need to get their plot of land going, often was worth more than the value of the share of the crop. So they couldn't actually pay their rent. So they're in debt further. And they have to keep working until they work it off. But they never work it off because the cycle repeats itself every year. And often, merchants and masters would just lie to them and tell them, oh no, you owe more money than what you actually put in. And they had no choice but to accept it for two reasons. One, many of them couldn't read because it was illegal to teach slaves to read. So the literacy rates were very low. And two, the plantation owner was some of the most powerful people in the American South who controlled the courts, they controlled the government. There was no legal recourse for slaves to challenge this. It's not like they could sue them. And so it created this situation where they were essentially tied to the land in similar but not exactly the same ways as the peasantry in various European and particularly England before the decline of feudalism in the 14th and 15th century. And you can see the difference, right? Here's the centralized plantation under slavery. And here is what sharecropping looks like, where each kind of slave family has a little plot of land. Okay. So as I said, what this meant was the breakup of large centralized plantations. And as we saw on that slide there, the difference. Now this system, we get this ruling consensus of white-owned land and black labor. Now, because sharecropping potentially gave former slaves far more autonomy than they would have had under a centralized system of wage labor, and I say potentially because they're tied to that land because of this system of debt dependency that they fall in, the planter class worked very hard to ensure that there would be no free market in land and labor. Now, the first restriction, as we saw, was debt, right? That they were constantly in debt to the master because they constantly owed them money, and the cycle continued sometimes over generations, so they couldn't actually go anywhere. And remember, back then, if you didn't pay your debt, you ended up in jail. And I'll explain a little bit more how that contributes to them being tied to the land in a minute. So this was not enough in and of itself. The role of law was central in restricting the political and civil rights of African Americans. Now, many of you are familiar, as I said earlier, with Jim Crow segregation, right? This idea that there's separate facilities for African Americans and whites, separate schools, separate water fountains, everything, complete segregation. But there was also specific laws designed to keep former slaves and their descendants on these plantations and restricting their mobility rights, essentially stripping them of all mobility rights. Think about it this way, right? In a free market, if you work for somebody who is treating you poorly Well, then the idea is if you're free, you go work for somebody else. Therefore, a boss has an incentive to treat their employees relatively well. Okay? So the first laws that they passed are something called enticement laws. Now, what this meant was it was illegal for another planter to recruit workers that were already working for another planter. They called it Enticement Act. So another white plantation owner could not go to sharecroppers on another plantation and try to get them to work for him. That would actually be illegal under this system. And they were come down on very, very hard. So that's the first thing. The second thing is immigrant agent laws. What this was designed to do was to prevent northern agent, like labor recruiters looking for cheaper labor for industrial factories in the north, from coming down and trying and basically taking black labor from the American South. And they did this by making the licensing fees outrageously expensive, to the tune of $100,000. And we're talking $100,000 in the 1860s and 70s. So we're talking millions of dollars now, right? It was way too expensive. Nobody was going to pay a licensing fee to recruit labor. So no labor was recruited in the American South for the North. The North could keep relying on a massive supply of immigration coming from Europe. The next set of laws is contract enforcement laws. So if a sharecropper in any way didn't adhere to some part of the contract, right, with the master or the plantation owner for their sharecropping agreement, they could be thrown in jail, right? Another thing is vagrancy laws. So, for example, it essentially made it illegal for African Americans not to work. So if you were an African American and you were just, say, potentially going about your business in a small town or anywhere along a kind of rural country road, and a police officer or even just a private white citizen stopped you and asked to see your labor contract and you didn't have one, you were regarded to be a vagrant. Essentially, it made it illegal for African Americans not to have a contract and therefore not to work. So if you didn't have a labor contract with somebody, like a sharecropping agreement with a plantation owner, you got put in jail. And these vagrancy laws combined with something called criminal surety laws, and they basically worked like this. Okay? Criminal surety laws meant that if you were arrested for a crime and had to pay a fine, and I was a plantation owner, I could pay your fine for you, but you had to come work for me. So basically, plantation owners would then pay the fines of people arrested under vagrancy laws or contract enforcement laws, and it forced them to come back and work for that particular plantation owner. So there was really no way for sharecroppers to leave their plot of land that they worked on. They had no freedom of movement, no freedom to seek employment with anybody else, or say, I don't want to work on the land anymore. I'm going to work in what little sort of sector of wage labor that does exist in some of the very small cities that were cropping up in the American South, right? So they were essentially tied to that land. There was no free market. They had no mobility. And then on top of this, you got what is referred to as convict labor. So in this case, you have the state would actually, and this is why I said earlier that exception to the 13th Amendment, except for punishment of a crime, is key here. Because if you were arrested and ended up going to jail or a penitentiary, that penitentiary or jail would put you in a prison gang, convict labor gang, like the chain gangs, think of, right? From, early American history. And they would lease that gang out to anybody that was willing to pay. And you can imagine with all these laws that were passed, if you were an African American person, man or woman, in the South at the time, it was very easy to get arrested. And there was every incentive for the state to arrest these people because then they could be sent back to work on a plantation or do public works or anybody that was willing to pay for it. And in many ways, this was the threat that was often hung over sharecroppers to prevent them from doing anything or leaving. So even if you wanted better terms or were threatening to leave, or you were just threatening not to work as hard, or you talked back to the master, the plantation owner could say, I will have you in breach of contract, or I'll have you arrested, and then you'll go to jail, you'll become part of a prison gang, and you'll end up working for me anyway. And if all of this didn't work, you had extra legal violence, right? With the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1860s and early 1870s, through basically acts of violent terrorism, the image of these kind of Klan members when they're white hoods, enacting horrible aspects of physical violence on African Americans, forced them, that there was no basic recourse for them. It kept them dependent on the land. It kept them as a dependent labor force with no mobility. And this is how sharecropping really functioned. So even though at first it sounds good, and initially it's what former slaves want, the legal apparatus and the restriction of the labor market that develops, combined with the political power of the state and the power that these plantation owners in a white supremacist society commanded, there was virtually no freedom that existed for sharecroppers to find work anywhere else. They essentially weren't slaves, but in many ways they were kind of like serfs. It's not the same thing as serfdom, but very, very similar to that. So as a result of all of this large group of laborers lacked mobility or basic civil and social rights and economic rights. So there was little incentive for the South to industrialize and mechanize because it was based on having this large labor force of people who were tied to the land. If they wanted to produce more, they just leaned on them in the same way that landlords and, say, absolutist France tried to squeeze the peasantry. And as a result of this, you got no commercial farming techniques. You got no mechanization. By 1940, there were 3.7 million mules and horses in the American South, but only 223 tractors. Didn't look like sort of mechanized farming that existed in the North. The only way, as I said, to expand and produce more crops was to squeeze their workers and their laborers, not new technology, because it could potentially threaten the socio-political order. Because if you got more efficient forms of agricultural production, it would mean a lot of these workers were no longer necessary. And there was this fear, this is a white supremacist society, of African Americans being able to go and do as they please in Southern society, right? So even though slavery is gone, they lacked basic mobility rights. And if they had them, the South feared, the white South feared what would actually happen. And because there was no move toward efficiency in agriculture, you didn't get, like you got in England, the sort of, expelling of the peasants off the land, right? African American agricultural workers stayed on the land. And because of that, you didn't get this dual market for land and labor like you got, commodities and labor like you got in England in the 15th and 16th centuries and beyond. So as a result, sharecroppers in many ways had one foot in the market and one foot in subsistence. One foot in the market in the sense that the share of the crop that they produced for the plantation owner went on a global market. But the other part of it, the other foot, was in subsistence agriculture. They grew their own food. They made their own clothes, just like peasants would have in England in the 14th and 15th century, right? So that market for commodities never took off in the South, and therefore you never got industrialization or commercial capitalism or agriculture, largely because there was no market. The labor force was tied to the land in the same way that peasants were in England in the 14th and 1500s. So you didn't get mechanization. You didn't get this market. And it's not until really the 1930s and the 1940s that this system starts to come apart. So the first kind of hole in the system emerges in World War I, where because of 4 million men are drafted into the US Army to go fight in France, all of a sudden there's 4 million jobs that are available in the North. So you do start to see African Americans start going north, and the planters can't hold them, largely because they need workers in the North for the war effort. And the other thing that happens is the Great Depression. So this system ends in the Great Depression because you get a collapse of agricultural prices. And as a result of that, the beginning of the end of the plantation economy. And the reason this happened was because the Great Depression collapsed agricultural prices. When Franklin Roosevelt comes to power in 1930, he's elected in 32, he becomes president in 1933, he passes what's called the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And it creates this Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which essentially pays farmers, and that includes plantation owners, not to sell their crop. And the reason they do this is because the value of cotton and all agricultural products is falling dramatically, right? And what happens in that situation? If you own something that you're trying to sell, and every day, every second, every hour, it's losing value, well, you're going to be in a panic to sell it. And so is everybody else that has that. And so in trying to avoid catastrophe, you end up creating basically a race to the bottom in terms of prices. So in order to prevent this, the federal government essentially was paying farmers and plantation owners not to sell their crop, to just hold on to it. Now, because sharecroppers were farmers, they were entitled to that money that was being paid by the federal government, right? So what happens right after this act is passed, plantation owners now decide, we're not going to renew your contracts as sharecroppers, you're going to be wage workers. And the reason they do that was because as sharecroppers, they're entitled to half of the money that would have counted for that particular plot of land. But as wage workers, they're entitled to nothing. So the only reason this system ends is because there's an incentive for plantation owners to no longer use sharecropping as a means of agricultural production, and they shift to wage labor. And as a result of that, from 1935 until 1940, sharecropping, at least the percentage of sharecroppers, declines by 20% in the American South, and the percentage of wage earners increases by 50% in the American South. And then after the Second World War, this is when you get an even larger migration of African Americans north, about 2 million, because they are no longer tied to this system of debt peonage that they can leave. And then you start to get mechanization in the South. And what's interesting is that disruption to the socio-political order that Southern white plantation owners feared if mechanization came in that disrupted the order, I mean, in a way that fear was founded, because less than 10, 15 years after the breakdown of the plantation economy, where African Americans in the South now have greater freedom of movement, many of whom leave the South and go to the North, you get the civil rights movement in the 1950s, and the entire order of Jim Crow segregation starts to come down. So this is what Weiner means by the Prussian road. It comes from this concept in Germany called Sonderweg, which was a distinct German path of history. Well, this is a distinct Southern path of history that resembles the Prussian road because you get the development and road to capitalism, but not with liberal democracy. And in fact, it is the collapse of this system that brings about mechanization and industrialization in the South in the 1930s and the 1940s, right? You had a stunted free labor market, labor repression, and illiberal politics. To sum it up, Jonathan Weiner puts it this way: the South between 1865 and 1900 was neither an immature form nor an incomplete version of the North. Its socioeconomic relations constituted a fully formed system that was qualitatively different from the North's classic capitalism. The distinctiveness arose out of the labor repressive nature of the South, Southern production, and the direct participation of the state in enforcing restrictions on the mobility of labor. The social relations of the Prussian Road not only guaranteed an abundant supply of low-cost labor, they were also incompatible with liberal democracy. All right, I'll leave it there, and then next you're going to look at a video where I interview Professor Rick Halpern about the South African case. And I think one thing you'll find interesting in the South African case is you'll also see parallels where you have a labor force, particularly in the mining industry, that has 1 foot in the market and 1 foot in subsistence, just like in the American South. All right, I'll leave it at that.